Oh, hey there. Thanks very much for checking out my. Hey there. Thanks for checking out my YouTube live sessions. I do appreciate it. So this is kind of. I try to do these once a week. Essentially, it's a cut and dry, no editing, no script, just a general conversation, questions and answers that people kind of forwarded to me as kind of an idea of what's going on with Turo, and it's just basically a general chit chat. So again, it's usually tour related topics. However, we do get into some automotive topics as well. And we kind of veer off into some other conversations. So it's not just Turo, it's going to be a little bit about uh, service and maintenance on cars. We talk about parts, sources, where to get them in Canada. We talk a little bit about shop rates, whether to take your car in to get repaired or whether you want to give it a try. So we actually give a little range on level of difficulty when it comes to regular maintenance items. Uh, we did a video on just the basics, like how to bulb, stuff like that. So again, we're not mechanics, so we're not telling you how to fix a car or rebuild an engine, but we're saying, hey, if you're doing the Turo check over, there are some things that you can do in your driveway that are pretty straightforward. So we um, check out my videos on those. So they're in the video section or they're in the shorts. So go through there. And if there's something that you have a question about, like the next topic I want to talk about is snow tires. I've already put my snow tires on my Outlander, but I think it's a good idea because we're in Southern Ontario. I have a discussion about what are the types of snow tires because it's not cut and dry. There's a mud and snow, and there's an all-season snow tire, and there's a regular snow tire, and there's studded snow tires, and then there's brands, and then there's different countries where they come from. What is the standard for a snow tire in Holland? Because we sell them here in Canada. So again, it's one of those things where we'll talk about that as we get a little closer to the winter season. Should you put them on rims or should you mount them on your regular tires? So we'll have a discussion about that. That's a topic unto itself. So that's where we're going with it. It's kind of automotive related. It's around Turo to a degree because I have two Turo cars. I'm new on the Turo platform. It's been a little over a year. So it's kind of like my hurdles and my learning the system and kind of getting familiar with it and just kind of going through that. Hey, here's an issue, or someone has sent me a little email that said, hey, we're thinking of getting into Turo and what are the plans? So we're going to talk today a little bit about the plans that Turo has on their platform. And we'll talk a little bit about what is the Turo platform and kind of what is the intended goal. Like, where are we going with it and what's the idea behind it? Because it's a very simple, we get overcomplicated with kind of thinking what it is and how it works. But it's a fairly easy item to kind of understand. It has been overcomplicated a little bit when you go to the Turo site. You kind of go, oh, there's a lot of legalese you have to kind of get familiar with and terms of service. So we're not going to get into terms of service today because that would take probably an hour to kind of go through each one. Um, I'm thinking I might do a series of shorts. Take maybe 3 minutes to 5 minutes and go through each one. And then you can kind of go and say, okay, well, which one am I interested in or which one do I have any questions about? Then you could go to the catalog of shorts and just quickly have a quick explanation and kind of how it's applied. If you think that's something we should do, or you think that's a topic that might be worthwhile for the Canadian market, send me a little chat off to the side. And again, these are live chats because I don't want to edit and I don't want to do any major scripting. So again, these are really raw, but the idea here is, boom, I can get it done in about an hour on a weekend. Um, I work a full-time job. Turo is a little bit of a side hustle. We talk about why I do Turo. You can control the hours. You can control the effort you put into it. So it's one of those things where if you wanted to open up a small business, Turo is a nice way of saying, okay, it's about as small as you can go with a traditional return from having a small style business. And if you're into cars and you like tinkering and it's a hobby of yours to begin with, like myself, well, it kind of complements that. So in other words, it's something I enjoy doing. It's something I can drive a very small income source from, like we're talking a drizzle. So it's not be aware of that. It's not a huge stream as far as money is concerned. Maybe as you move up, that'll build up as far as like once you get to four cars, if you're got two little streams, you got one that's a home run. Well, maybe you're doing well. Maybe you have one car that rotates out because it needs to get repaired. Like you can kind of wipe that out with four. With one, you're kind of just kind of moving along. You're just learning the system. So That's where we've been at with the Outlander. We've made some mistakes as a new host would, so we've had some delays with it. We've fell down at the bottom of the listings for a little while there because of pricing. Then we went back up because of pricing. Then we fell down a little bit because the market has slowed a little, at least just by comparing what's being rented kind of in the region and what's available. There's a certain Turo platform right now. So it's hard to kind of get filtered back up to the top when you're competing with 20 or 30 cars in my area, which is very small. So it's one of those things where you look at it and go, okay, if you were in Toronto or Montreal, where Turo's a little more of a, well, it's got a little more appeal to it, and there's a lot more hosts on it, means you're competing with a lot more people. How do you kind of get beyond the crowd and book your car a lot? Is it price point? Is it ratings? Is it just availability? Like, is that the idea of branding? Like, is a Mazda going to rent more than a Mitsubishi? It's just one of those things that we'll talk about later. But today we had a question about insurance plans through Turo, and it's pretty cut and dry in Canada. In the US, you have a lot more options. I think they've got a 10% program. We don't have that up here, so we can't keep 90. So Turo, I think, and I've heard a couple videos down in Texas and a few other areas where they're running a 10% Turo program, which leaves like with a huge deductible. You're essentially just really getting a liability policy in that situation. It's one of those things where if you're running cash cars like myself, I would look at a 10%. It's not available to me, but it's one of those things I would review and go, okay, I would have to write that car off in the event of a major accident. So I would be kind of self-insured from that standpoint, but the liability aspect of it would be covered. So in other words, the broader scope of a major injury or major insurance claim, like massive, would be covered, but I would still take a personal hit. Deductible, I think down there is $5,000 US, which in Canada, I think that represents around 7,500, which probably by the time you go through the yada yada insurance stuff, it's probably really 10 grand. So a $10,000 deductible on a car that's a cash car that's worth, let's call it, you bought it and you're into it for 7. So you see what I mean? Like your deductible would wash out the car. So it's one of those things where you look and go, okay, so you're essentially self-insured. So, and that could be worth it. It's one of those things where if you're running a fleet and you're averaging out anyways, and you're kind of going, okay, well, if I've got 30 cars and I got to kick back 10% to Turo, that's fair. Like, that's an insurance coverage cost. And if I lose 1 or 2 out of the fleet, it gets washed out by the earnings that I would have made in a larger metropolitan center. Like, I think that would be the logic behind it. And for minor little repairs, you would chase after the renter yourself. So in other words, if they backed into a pole and damaged the bumper, you'd still go through the claims process, right? Like, you still chase them down for that repair work, but you would really be the one doing that effort from that standpoint. At least that's the way I understand it. Or you say to yourself, okay, there's a cutoff. You're going to run through the insurance policy that the renter would have, and again, you'd go through Turo and so forth. So you'd have some coverage, but it would be one of those things where you're really on your own at that 10% program that's available in the States, not Canada. So what do we have here in Southern Ontario? So let's get down to the nitty gritty. I had my little chat GTP, or my little AI, help me out with this. So we just basically, instead of going through Turo's long-winded explanation, we're just going to go boom, 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 some points, right? And we'll try and answer each one as far as that's concerned. So the conversation I had with somebody who's in Moncton. So again, small community, thinking of putting their car up on Turo, and they're hesitant about it. And I understand that. Like, there's a certain level of fear when you're putting your car out there. At the same time, you have to kind of look at the level of risk associated with starting another business. So in other words, you have a fixed asset, your car. It should be paid for in an ideal world. That eliminates some personal insurance issues that you'd have as it relates to a banknote. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But again, if you're starting out, you want to pick a car that you already have, that's already paid for, so the level of risk is a little lower. So you already know the history behind the car. You already have kind of an idea what the maintenance is all about and the serviceability. So you know it's been a good car. You know you've maintained it. You know the tires are decent, the brakes are decent. So it's not going to be a huge investment to get it up for the Turo platform. It's just going to be, okay, we have to clean it, get it tidy. Maybe you got to do a couple little things to kind of get it on the platform just as a preventative. Um, but that would be the first step, is to take your very first car, which you should already have or have access to pretty easily. Now, if you're going to go and buy a car from Turo, that's that's a kettle of fish. So it's one of those things where we'll have that discussion. And I'm kind of going through that right now with the Hyundai that we bought, the 2013 Genesis. So check the videos on that, because we talk about how to find the car, how to check the VIN, check history. In Ontario, what's required. So you have to get the buyer-seller's package. At the price point I'm in, traditionally, they don't seem to have it, so you have to get it yourself. So nice thing, it's really easy. It's $20. You walk into the space, and you can buy it at any MTO. So it's not a big deal from that standpoint. It's a lot cheaper than a Carfax report or car report. It almost covers everything except for maintenance. So you don't get the maintenance history with it, but it gives you pretty much everything else. So as far as doing the pre-check or kind of doing the quick little run before you go look at the car, if it's a serious vehicle where you know the numbers are decent, you know you're going to be at it, that's the one I would go with. Again, it's kind of off topic a little bit. And if you're going to look for a vehicle, there's like the top 5 Turo cars to kind of focus on. And I'll do a video on that as well. I don't subscribe to that to a certain extent, because I'm looking for value in a vehicle or a brand that's the market has kind of ignored or off the radar a little bit. So kind of like the orphan brands to a certain extent. It's kind of where I kind of focus my Turo experience, because Mitsubishi is kind of a lost brand in Canada. It's one of those things that doesn't get a lot of notoriety. It seems to be a decent, reliable Japanese car. It seems to be in the same category for me, at least my opinion, as a entry-level Toyota, or even maybe slightly better than a Honda, but it's in that realm, right? So it's one of those things where you kind of go, proven track record. Most of the mechanics of it are bulletproof. So that's kind of the off-brand that I kind of moved to. You got Subaru. It's another kind of off-brand a little bit that seems to be not really a dominant force on Turo. But it's one of those things that you look at, you kind of go, okay, so I kind of deviate from those 5 top picks and check my videos. We'll do a top 5 pick based on other Turo hosts. But let's get into the insurance coverages in Canada. So we'll go from there. So insurance, number 1, know the car you're in already. So in other words, do a little work. If you're already paying personal insurance on a vehicle, you already kind of know the cost. Right? So that's essentially it, right? So you have to cover insurance on the personal level when the car is not out on Turo. So the Turo program covers the car when the renter is driving it. When you're driving your car, you need insurance. So that's the process. So now if you're running a vehicle that has heavy financing on it, there's going to be terms and conditions attached to that banknote. The lender has said, okay, well, this is the policy you need to have on this car. For me to maintain the banknote, I need to keep that policy in place. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of times the finance companies or the lenders will have little conditions in place about commercial use. And yes, most lenders consider Turo to be a commercial application. So it brings it into question, and it kind of goes, okay, well, what would be their opinion if they found out that you're running their lovely car, because it's theirs until it's paid for, even though the ownership is in your name, there are conditions to meet. They may have an issue with that. So it's one of those things where you can either have that discussion ahead of time and say, okay, where are we at with it? And maybe the lender's okay. And we'll say, okay, well, we need to verify that the Turo policy is coverage and it meets our requirements, in which case this may factor into the package you pick. So you follow what I'm getting? We don't have the 10% program in Canada. So we've got, have a little look. So we've got a 75 and an 85% plan. So you can see where a lender might be questioning if you just bought the car, you haven't paid the taxes on the finance, you haven't paid the administration fees, you haven't addressed the depreciation. So a lender may have some issues with that. Now, you might be halfway through a banknote and the lender may go, let's flip it. Let's turn it into a personal line of credit or an asset-based line of credit where the car is still part of it. It's tied to that. And some banks will do that for you. So Scotia, I know a couple clients have done that through Scotia Bank, where they've gone and said, "Hey, look, I'm at the situation where potentially I can't pay the car. I can do Turo to pay the bill." And they went in and they talked to their bank manager, explained the situation. And they've had a couple situations where they said, "Okay, well, we can flip you into a line of credit." Now, they had some real estate investment too, so it was a little easier for them from that standpoint. So I think, Joe Schmo out there, they just put 3 months in payments into his 1-year-old or 2-year-old pre-owned car, probably isn't going to have that option. It's one of those things where if you're a little more financially stable and there's a few other options there for you on finance plans, maybe you can flip into something along that line. But it still leaves you open where you kind of go, okay, well, what am I covered with? Right? Because now you're kind of self-insured. If the car goes missing or gets damaged, you're on the hook for that line of credit. You have to pay it off. So again, we're just mitigating. We're just moving some of the responsibility off onto your shoulders instead of the insurance company. So that's where you have to kind of ask yourself, well, what do I really want covered? And what can I afford as far as taking the personal financial hit with? So could you afford to walk away from that car and be on the hook for that note? Like that's a big question, right? So insurance coverage is important. So every host must carry their own personal auto insurance, and that's required by law in Canada anyway. So that's like a no-brainer. So Intact, that's the company I deal with because they're part of Turo. They kind of complement each other in the fact that they're essentially the same policy. So I did that on purpose so that I don't have to worry about overlaps or omissions. So if I were with a Wananisa or I was with another insurance company, I would be concerned that they had reviewed the Turo coverage, which is through Intact. Um, I might have a gap in something. If it was something major, it could be an issue, right? So, and that would be attached to bigger liability pictures. I wouldn't be too deeply concerned about a dent in the door, but a major traffic issue where you've had a fatality and there's a big payout, I'd want to make sure there isn't a little gap. So I bundled my insurance with the same company that Turo has, so there isn't any real question there in my mind about, oh, well, they put the Turo package together, they know what it's covered, and they put my personal insurance together, and I've acknowledged that with my broker that I'm doing Turo. So we've already verified that everything is kind of bleeds together, right? There isn't going to be anything that's going to be lacking. So you need to review that on your insurance renewal. So that might be something you might want to do as a little anniversary date if you're thinking of doing Turo and your insurance is coming up in December. Well, then December is kind of the time you may want to switch insurance companies. Again, you want to get a competitive quote and see that. I actually found that because the previous broker I was with seemed to just forget I was there. When I switched to another broker, the rates were pretty much dead on. Like it really wasn't a huge savings for me to go to another broker, but it wasn't really a huge loss either. So it's one of those things, brokers. So that's, you may have to find an agent that works for you. I find that if you're with a insurance company that is um, automation based, so you got the little call center ring ring, and the person really doesn't have any real knowledge on Turo, or they don't really have any real knowledge on insurance. So you gotta remember they're just using call centers, and they're just typing away on their little keyboard, going, "Oh, Keith has a question. Let's go to Chat GTP." Yeah, that seems to be the trend in Ontario. So you don't really get an educated broker calling these big insurance companies up to get, well, big insurance brokers up to get really full details, especially on a Turo package, because it's a little unique. It's not everyone's doing it. So it's not where you can say, hey, the last guy just asked us about it, so we've already been through it. So you need to go to an actual real live mom and pop uh, little office, little door insurance broker. And you need to sit down with somebody and say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. Enlighten me, please. And get someone who's been in the business for a little while. Because if they've been doing commercial insurance, or they in a rural environment like where I'm at, farm policies and garage policies are pretty common. So to go through the Turo items, it's actually almost like a garage policy or a farm equipment policy. So they're very similar as far as the animal that you're working with. So little deviation, but pretty close. So my insurance broker was fairly knowledgeable of the terms. and kind of the applications. So you need to find a broker that you can say, hey, have you worked with a client with Turo before? Do you know the steps with it and what's covered, what's not? Then they'll review this with you as well to make sure you're comfortable with it. So finding a good broker, it'll save you a ton of headache, and headache is money. Time spent trying to figure this out. If you go to a qualified insurance broker, they'll do the figuring for you, right? And you can kind of just say, okay, well, there's the package, there it is. Lo and behold, like for instance, the 4-car cutoff, which is the insurance companies in Canada, at least Southern Ontario. I can't put more than 4 vehicles on to Turo because there's a limitation on the personal policy, my end. And if you're a Turo host out there and you're running beyond the 4 cars, you may have had to break that up under a spouse's name, or you may have had to do it differently, as far as that's concerned, to be able to get to 8 cars or to get to 12 cars. In Ontario, my broker explained to me that if you're going to 4, you're essentially, in the eyes of the insurance company, a small leasing company, or you're a very tiny leasing company, or you're a small rental provider, like really tiny. Like in the grand scheme of things, when you're looking at other folks that are actually doing it for a business, they're running fleets. Like we're talking 15 cars and up is usually considered the small, right? So Turo is really, if you're just looking for that little drizzle, like that little tiny little drip of money, it's perfect for that. And you just want the experience, it's perfect for that. Like you just want to do the 1 car, top it up at 4. Maybe you're going to get a couple of cars that you consider to be specialty in certain nature. I'm doing kind of bread and butter, dailies, that type of thing. But if you had something where you said, okay, no, I'm dabbling in my hobby. Maybe you're a Mustang guy and you now have, 3 generations of Mustangs and you like to put them out on Turo and offset some of the costs involved with maintaining a borderline, performance car or an exotic or something that would be perceived to be a little different than your average renter would be looking at. So in other words, if I'm going to Tilden, I'm looking for a bread and butter, newer car, like every other rental car. But maybe I'm in that little market where I go, I want a 3-year-old 500 series Mercedes. Well, Turo's really the only real avenue for that kind of, not really an exotic car, but just different. So you may want to cater to that market. I'm not doing that. I'm doing kind of a local blue collar, you need a car to get to work kind of thing. So my cars aren't really exotic or perfect. And I make that really clear when they're booking. I say, these are daily drivers. And usually most clients that I've been dealing with kind of go, oh, okay, perfect. Because they don't want to get dinged for a bunch of, stuff after the fact that may or may not have been their fault. So like my Outlander's gone out a couple times and it's come back with a couple little door dings and a couple little marks that may have happened if I'm driving it. Like it's one of those things where it wasn't intentional, right? And it's kind of like, well, no, I put a little bit aside for every 6 months we go take care of door dings and dents and little stuff, right? So I don't chase after the little stuff, like in that regards. Like if it's abusive and it looks like it's been intentional and it's going to cost, hundreds and hundreds of dollars to fix it, well then, yeah, I'm gonna have an issue, like if you bang a bumper, that type of deal. But you have to be aware that out of pocket, what I describe as daily use, wear and tear, Turo's not going to cover that under their policy. You're going to be on the hook for that. So if that's going to drive you insane because you have the perfect car and you're going to OCD on it, you're going to go nuts. So be aware of that. So you have to carry your own personal insurance. Now, in the States, my understanding is your personal insurance will become active when the Turo policy becomes inactive. So in other words, you got the vehicle out on rent, your policy is on hold, right? So you're not double paying for that day. So it's like, okay, Turo's got the coverage. My policy goes into kind of a hold setting. So I'm not in the car. I'm not driving the car. It's not my car really on the road at that point. That's a Turo car. Turo's responsible for the insurance and paying for that timeline. In Canada, say they do that, but the insurance doesn't do that. So they're not set up for that. So you're paying your personal insurance for the full 30 days. If you got the vehicle out for 25 or 15 days out of the month, you go, okay, well, great. Now I can cut my costs in half, which I think they do down in the States. We can't do that in Canada. So at least my broker can't do it. And she is fairly knowledgeable. I think she is. So if you're in Southern Ontario and you have a broker that allows you to do that, or they figure out a way to do it, I'd love to get a comment off to the side. But so far, everywhere I've gone, it's been like, no, no, we don't do that. It's an administrative nightmare, probably. So that's an issue to keep track of whether the car is on or off. Um, that's probably the underlying issue. Plus the fact that they're probably looking for the cash, right? So there's a reason why they're in business. So when it's out in Canada, you have to have your personal policy, which if you're running a cash car, you've stripped down to just the bare bones, right? So you're just doing essential liability that's required to be on the road. That's it, right? You want to keep that as low as possible because in a perfect world, it's going to be out with Turo like 90% of the time. So really the only time you're going to have your car back, if you're doing it like a small business, is when you're going to be running it to the car wash, when you're going to be taking it to the shop for regular maintenance, when you're getting a dent pulled out, when you're doing cleanup in your driveway. Like that's when you want it covered, or when you finally get a chance to take it out for a weekend because it's your car, right? So, but in a perfect world, it's out, right? But you're still paying for that in Canada. So be aware of that. That's why a cash car is an advantage over a finance car because you can get away with that bare minimum, right? And that's a big deal in Southern Ontario. Insurance is fairly expensive in comparison to the stateside. So if you're doing a US price point, you kind of go, oh, well, they can do a car for $30 a day in Texas, and a bread and butter Toyota Yaris or something like that. And you kind of go, I can see why they can do that because their overhead cost is substantially less because of the insurance policy they run with. So up in Canada, we can't do that, which means chasing after, like, for instance, I had a Chevy Cruze. Well, by the time I factored my insurance costs, my maintenance, and a few little repairs on the car, in order to be competitive in the marketplace, I had to be at that $30 mark, right? So at $30 with the percentage that Turo takes, I'm not making a lot per day on that car. If anything, if it goes sideways a little bit and I need to do some repairs, that car is going to cost me money. So I'm going to lose on that one. So you have to kind of say to yourself, well, what car can I put on Turo that can drive a profit based on that? So you have to look at something that's a little, I'm not saying exotic, but like a four-door sedan instead of a micro compact. So a Mitsubishi Mirage, unless you're like the GTA and you get remarkably good insurance to offset that cost and you're always busy with it because volume is a key thing on that, you might be able to do okay. But it's not going to be a huge profit winner and you're limited to four. So you're going to say to yourself, well, why would I bring in a slow pitch player? I like the Moneyball analogy. We've done that before. So why would I bring in a low level player on a team of four cars? I want four big hitters. I want four performers. I want that top 10% in the Turo business. I want to be able to be busy. So I have to be very selective on the cars that I'm picking. And I have to look at the dailies before I buy a car. And I have to be in a category that works, right? So subcompacts for me, or micro cars, like a Mini Cooper probably wouldn't work because the ROI on it and the sizing of the car, I couldn't recoup on that one. The insurance would be too high, the service cost would be too high, the rate of depreciation would be too high. The daily that you're going to get a return on isn't going to work based on the percentages that are presented. So that's the issue you have to look at when you're shopping for a car, how insurance factors in. So that's your personal coverage. So again, be aware that you need to have it. So third-party liability insurance through Turo is $2 million Canadian. So hold your horses. Sounds like a lot of money, but um, that's your bare coverage. So you may want to talk to your broker and say, okay, well, Turo's giving me a $2 million liability on third-party damage. Should I up that? And you may want to, depending on the area you're in, because $2 million on a huge claim, like something with a fatality attached to it, or major damage to like a building, or you always think worst case scenarios. Okay, so they lost control of the vehicle and they drove through a fully active schoolyard. Well, that's going to be well over, as far as, you know what I mean? So it's one of those things you want to have a discussion with your broker with. Now you can run basics and you kind of go, okay, well, maybe we hit over to the gambling table, we give it a spin. Maybe we stay with just Turo's program, and it is what it is, right? So, but you have to be aware of that. Okay, and this is where protection plan. So this is where we're going to talk a little bit about percentages. So we got that 10% down in the States, and they've got a variety. So each state's a little different. Each country's a little different. Each region's a little different. So you need to check on Turo with your region and say, okay, well, where I'm at. And they change. So be aware of that. So it's one of those things where once a year, I think they sit down and review their insurance coverages, and little things alter. So you need to go over that on the renewal times just to make sure that you're still covered as you would think you are. So again, they communicate this. They don't have a live session or a news area. And these little blurbs off to you, and they kind of go in your email and they end up in the junk mail. But it's one of those things where you need to review that as terms of service, right? So what do we got? Deductibles. So this is really what it boils down to on the plan. So on the 75% plan, so again, that's the norm. Most people do 75%. I can tell when people are talking because it's just kind of the default setting, right? So that means Turo's taking 25% of that rental rate. So when you look at a car that's going out for $50, well, let's see the math easy. So you rent the car for 40. Well, Turo's taking 10, right? And then they take their fees from the renter as well. So there's earnings for them on the opposite side for booking, for being the booking agent, and a few other options they can sell or upgrade to a better insurance policy, better coverage for the client, right? So they have an option to sell some more product. You don't get that option. So it's kind of like, you're kind of like the car dealer. So you've sold the car. Congratulations, yay. So you sold the car. In their business model, you would go into the business office afterwards, right? So you've done the test drive, you got the client in, they've agreed to buying the car, the contract is completed. Now they're going to go into the business office. And Turo is essentially the finance office version in our kind of scenario. So they're going to offer packages. So, and that's where they're going to make their money. So they take that 25% of your earnings is theirs on that plan. Now the deductible is going to change. So that's going to be the lower deductible for you. But at the same time, they're not going to cover things like wear and tear. They're not going to cover smoking. They say they do, but it's really hard to get it covered. So like little stuff, you're going to basically have to eat it. So even on the 75% plan. So it's one of those things where if you're going to have to eat all the little things, and you're like, for instance, good example, I had to do a brake line because I had a client that snagged something on the road down in the States, and that represented about $1,000 worth of damage. To go through the whole process with Turo, then you have a deductible attached to it. Really, I'm better off trying to get a little bit out of the client and say, look, can you cover half because it's your fault? Or can you cover a portion of it, or something along that line? Or you say to yourself, let's keep the rating decent. I factor a little bit. A dealer would put a lot pack in because my background is that. A lot pack is a small percentage of your business that is set aside to the end of the year as a little bit of a bonus, right? So in other words, if you don't use the money, great. It's a slush fund to go do something special, right? Buy a nav system or replace something on the car with something a little fancier. That's your slush fund for the end of the year, right? But that slush fund is what I use in the event, like, for instance, a client runs over a cinder block, right? Nicks a brake line, right? And yes, it's their fault. But because the way in which Turo is set up and the deductible attached to it from my end, and then the client, and then the logistics of the whole thing, at that point, if it's $1,000 and under, I'm actually better off saying, look, try and get that out of the renter and try and negotiate that and say, okay, let's not go through the policies. Let's not make a stink about it, because then it's going to be on a record somewhere. And it's going to affect your policy down the road when you go to renew something on your own, saying that you've made a claim, right? So you're better off just saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to take care of some minimum damage on my own, and be aware of that, working into your business plan. So the 75% rule is kind of the norm. Lower deductible, but you have to check your region to find out exactly what that is. The 85%, which is kind of what's available here, higher deductibles. So we're looking at $2,000 to $5,000 depending on where you're at. Right. Again, if you're in the States, it changes dramatically because I think they have 4 or 5 different plans you can pick from down there. So the 85, you're going to bear a little more risk. So in other words, but you're bearing a lot of risk at the 75 anyway. So it's one of those things where if you're running 4 cars, which is kind of, it doesn't work with this plan. Like if you're running 10 cars in the States, the 10% makes sense because you can create your own little slush fund for covering a deductible on a car. And hopefully in an ideal world, you're not doing, 4 deductibles in a year. Maybe you're doing one major, repair. But on our 4 plan, like on with the 4 cars, the 85 does work, but you have to be really eyes wide open on it. You're going to go, okay, well, with a $2,000 deductible on a cash car or a $5,000 deductible on a cash car, are you really going to get terribly excited about the process, right? So if a good example. So on that Hyundai Genesis, because I bought it at that little bottom end curve where I pay 4,000 plus the repair work and the taxes. So I'm really into it for, let's call it 7. And the insurance assesses the value at 58, which is okay. That's what it is. I've got to eat the tax. I got to eat the repairs on it. So if it just got into an accident today, right? So the deductible in my situation is, let's call it $5,000. So really, I'm getting 700 and change. So you understand where the process isn't all that exciting for me. I don't want to have to do that claim, right? It's one of those things where, in an ideal world, I want that car to run for a year without anything major, and that's the gamble I take taking a cash car, and I will run the 85% plan. And if it's something under that $5,000 mark, which in auto repair land for body work, usually you can kind of skirt a few things, like say, okay, you know what, I can buy a bumper online already painted. So I'm not going to the body shop with their high hourly rate. I can bolt and unbolt it. So I'm saving some money there. Or they broke a tail light, which means I can outsource it and go on to autoparts.com per se, or go to the used parts section and pick up a U pullet or an off the shelf rear tail light. You know what I mean? Like I can mitigate some of those lower expenses and offset that with the host and say, look, instead of making a huge claim and chasing you around, it's a $75 headlight used. I'm going to bill you $75 in parts. Bob's your uncle. You might want to try and get a little labor out of them, but most of the time I just kind of say, hey, you know what? You did the damage. It happens. Life is like that. The bumper is $785. I want an hour's worth of labor, and work it from there, right? So, but it's one of those things where, as a host, you have to be able to acknowledge that and say, okay, we're probably going to be doing a lot of our own litigation and negotiation when it comes to accidents and small claims. Big stuff, it's going to go to Turo. But even when you do a call into Turo, they're not terribly excited. The process is going to be get an inspector, have the vehicle towed, yada yada yada. It's going to be a slippery slope, and then the vehicle's going to be off service for the professional to do it. So in other words, if I take my car to a body shop in Listowel, I might be looking at 3 weeks out before they get it into the shop, let alone a parts delay, or I might be getting an issue with priority of the work. In other words, I'm a small little client with no real slush fund for insurance to dig into. So they're looking at kind of going, it's essentially a cash job with Turo. They haggle the bits out of the shops. They're going to go, oh yeah, it's on the priority list when, when the shop is quiet and the guys have little to nothing to do, your car will come in. So you have to be aware of that. So it's one of those things where it could snowball that into not just the claim itself, but a month off Turo. If you're using that as an income source, it could be problematic. You don't normally factor that in when you're thinking about it, but it's a time issue, right? Okay, so how do I mitigate some of that? How do I take care of those liability issues? Terms of service. Read the terms of service. So we'll do some live sessions. We're getting up to 45 minutes. So I'll unwind it here because we're kind of going the insurance natter, and you're probably halfway asleep at this point. I should play some Enya in the background so you can actually use it as a sleeping video. Maybe I'd get increased viewership. That's a joke. So pre-trip and post-trip photos and videos and documentations of the car. Follow your terms of service and document the living daylights out of your car. So as a first-time Turo host, I made the exact same mistake where it's like, click, there we go, there's a picture of the car, here's the keys, good luck, Bob's your uncle. And thank God most of the folks that I deal with are polite, happy, cheerful, friendly locals that kind of have the idea that you're doing them a favor to a certain extent because you're half the price of a rental agency. You don't need a credit card. Citizenship is not an issue with me, where apparently it is at some of the renting agencies where they go, no, you only have a year's worth of experience. Whereas Turo just tacks a little extra insurance on it. You're good to go. And if you've got a price sensitive car where it's on the low end anyways, roll in the extra insurance if you're renting the car, especially if it's like if you're under the age of 25, you're a bad driver to begin with, right? Factor in the fact that maybe you're 1 year into Canada. So I'm not painting pictures here. It's just you tend to get into that category where it could be your first winter, right? You're going to put the car in the ditch. It has nothing to do with the car. It has nothing to do with you per se as the driver. It's just the fact that roads are going to get icy and slippery. And I put snow tires on my vehicle, but at the same time, they're not a get out of jail item. They're not going to make the car drive upside down. They're going to give you a little extra traction, like 20% extra grip, a little extra braking, but they're not going to solve a lot of issues. So that's where getting to know how a car handles in the snow and getting to know how bad weather is, 4 seasons. It's not really a welcome to Canada moment. Like, hey, you're all bad drivers. It's not that. It's the fact that you're not experienced enough to have gone through that first winter, right? So you get into our neck of the woods, like Goderich, where we have that lake effect, where you're going to be traveling along. You're going to go, well, this is pretty easy, no problem. Then all of a sudden, boom, you're into like 2 feet of snow for like 10 minutes, and it's a whiteout. And that's what happens, right? You go, well, that was sneaky. How'd that happen? And you don't remember to slow down. And when you do slow down, you apply the brakes. That's kind of a no-no, right? So you apply the brakes, and of course, at that point, the car does the little wiggly, and next thing you know, you're into oncoming traffic. In order to solve that problem, you do a sharp turn to the left, which makes you go to the right, and the right puts you into the farmer's field, right? Drive along, you'll see a ton of cars that have done that. It just happens, right? So load up on the insurance if you're under 25 and you're new and you're not familiar with the 4 weather seasons in Canada. And I would do the exact same thing if I were renting a car for the first time and I was in Bangladesh. Your driving style in India is quite a bit different than the driving styles in Canada. And you have to mitigate other things on the road and other drivers far more than you would do here in Canada, right? So it's one of those things where I would load up insurance like big time if I were traveling into the UK or traveling down to Mexico, because again, I'm not climatized or used to the driving there. So you want to do the same thing here. So if you're renting a car, please spend a little bit of extra money at Turo, load up on that extra insurance because it's going to save you a lot of headaches. And it saves me a lot of headaches. And to be honest with you, if you send me a little email, like when we do the chat, I always ask, well, what policy did you pick up? And you say, oh, no, I'm fully covered. It's all done. I loaded up on everything. At that point, I'm gonna breathe a sigh of relief and kind of go, you know what? If you want the car for 2 months, I'll cut you a really, really good deal. Like I don't do monthly rentals. I have, but it's usually after the person's had the vehicle for 3 weeks, and the conversation comes up about, yeah, I'm using this on a fairly regular basis. Then the conversation is like, well, I will give you a really good monthly rate if you offset that by picking up the full package on insurance, so that I don't have to worry about coverage in the event of an accident, right? And I've done that with one client, and they were like, "Cool, like perfect. I'll like 50% off." Like I gave them a really, really, really kick-ass deal on that. And the reason being is because I've already experienced them for the last 3 weeks. Communication was amazing. My little GPS meter came up with like, "Oh, they're driving like an ordinary person. Like it's not the speed limit. Like they're not right there. They're maybe 5 or 10 kilometers over, kind of like the norm, but they're just a good client. For them, I will do a 50% discount. No problem. Turo's automated discount on monthlies are like 45. I don't know the client. I don't know anything about them. They may not even have the proper coverage in place. They might have gone super cheap, right? I have no interest in chasing after that client. By the time you factor a 45% discount off a rate that I tailor to be competitive to begin with, it doesn't work. And that's where the insurance kicks in. You kind of go, oh, that eats into your profit, right? So you kind of go, yeah, if I'm familiar with the client and they've run full package, I will gladly go long-term on I'll go 3 months, a year, like at half price. I'm okay with that. My Outlander's a good example. If I had a client come in and they said, hey, you know what? I'm having issue with financing. I can't get this done. I need a car like 24/7. And I'll go, okay, well, let's have a conversation about that. Level of expectation and care, maintenance. What are you prepared to acknowledge getting into the car? Like, are you prepared to give me a call with an update every 2 weeks? Are you prepared to let me run through a quick loop, on the second month and do a quick inspection? And these are all things that most clients, if they're really logical, will go, "Oh, that's in my best interest. Yes, please. You know, 60 days. Can I run it over to the 39.95 oil change?" And they just put it up in the hoist, and I can ask them to say, "Hey, a part of that 39.95 oil change, which is like it's never that price; it's always more." They'll give me a reading on the brakes. They'll give me a quick little run through. And usually, if I talk to the apprentice or the technician, say, "Look, this is a rental car. It's a private rental car. I don't want any headaches. Can you just tell me if anything's leaking?" And usually they kind of go, "Ooh." And they'll really go over the car really well and say, "Hey, you know what? We did the battery test. It's at 85%. We did this, that. Looks like a serpentine belt." And it's like, yeah, I want to get all that stuff out of the way, so there isn't a headache. So that's where having a conversation with your client or the renter about insurance coverage is important. And again, that's where that business office model, Turo, they make that money. They're making the profit on that. So that's where they're really deriving some of their cash from, right? So just be aware of that. Okay, reporting damage. So on the app, on the wonderful little phone, which we should actually go over the phone app sometime. When you're a guest, there's an app for applications. You have to bundle some, and that's as a new host, I was not aware of that. So again, this is terms of service, and that's why you go with the cash car to begin with. So if you make some mistakes, it's not the end of the world, but it's one of those things where you're going to fall on your face a couple times. So I put a little dossier together with all the insurance coverage. So if they do have an issue, it's like, let's pull over that, let's open that up, and there's the policy, there's the rental agreement, there's the contact information, and then the directions to the app to take photos, right? So, and then they can start the process right then and there. So if they get into a small little fender bender, it's like cops show up, it's like, don't worry about it, it's covered. Hand the documentation file over to them, they'll figure it out. They're very knowledgeable. Then you got to call Turo as the guest and start the process of, hey, I got into an accident. This is the file number, and you need to have that discussion and a little note that this is the process, right? So that's one of the things you need to educate or inform your client of before they head out. So traditionally, a 75% plan, lower deductible. Um, they take some of your money, so just be aware of that. So 25% gets kicked back to Turo. 85% plan. Um, you know what? For the deductible issues, you have to review that. It may be something you'll consider. As far as that's concerned, that's where Turo takes 15%. Do you have less coverage? Depends on the car you're in, the comfort level you want. Um, it's one of those things where you look at it and kind of go, okay, you have to review that. But again, higher deductibles, depending on where you're at, province-wise, it could be $2,000 to $5,000. That's Canadian, so be aware of that. There is a 70% plan available in some provinces, kind of the middle of the road one. It's a little different. So it's one of those things where you're going to want to, it's kind of a hybrid between the two. So maybe the middle ground's good for you, whatever you feel comfortable with. I always like to look at the car I'm putting on Turo and what the cost would be to repair it, right? So that's where we're going. So can I get a bumper painted and shipped for $700? Yeah, I'm a Mitsubishi, I can. If it was a Mercedes, probably not. So you have to be aware of kind of what your part costs are and what would be really, it costs me, I think $300 once a year to go and remove all the dings and dents from a dent guy. It's like two something and change. But I've got to go when there's lots of dents. It's like two dents, it's not worth it because it's just a flat rate, right? So that's how I work that. Be aware wear and tear is not covered. So if the engine goes while they're traveling, it's going to be really difficult to prove it was a client issue unless it's something so blatantly obvious. Turo really won't cover that. So you're taking a gamble on those for mechanical failures. Be aware of that. So if you're driving a car that's, is going to get hit hard because it's a performance car, they're going to drive the living daylights out of it just because that's the nature of it. It's the way it's designed. You need to be aware of that. If you're driving a bread and butter car, not so much. But still, that's what your GPS tracker is for, so you can kind of stay on top of that. So that's the insurance coverage, kind of long-winded, and my conversation with my little inserts of things that's covered and not. But terms of service, I'll leave a link down below, and I think I will start doing some little 3-minute shorts on each term of service. So there'll be a little catalog where you can say, okay, well, I'm curious, what are the photos all about? Maybe I'll do a series where it's like, here's the 75 photos I take of the car before it leaves, or the 100 photos I take before the car leaves. Or here's the process when it comes to documentation on the way out. When the client comes to pick the car up, how does the point-to-point drop off where you're not in contact? Maybe we'll talk about that in terms of service. So again, if you do a little thumbs up, if you subscribe, that would be great. I'm trying to keep these live sessions kind of minimal. I should have broken this up into 2 parts. But again, if you're new on Turo, leave a question. Or if you're a seasoned host and you go, hey, Keith, it'd be really nice to chit chat to you about the item you've missed, that would be great. Again, being new, only a year into it, I'm still learning, still developing the new car that's on there. Hopefully we make less mistakes with, and you kind of get to see the process. We had a bit of a loss of video content because somebody hit the all delete button on YouTube and we killed, I think, 10 videos. So I'm trying to redo those videos as it relates to the Hyundai. So watch for those. And they're kind of like how I put it on Turo, how I bought the car, how I did the check beforehand, the inspection process when I bought it, how the safety program works in Ontario, getting it onto Turo and getting it rolling. We're doing that. So check the other videos. So again, thank you very much for taking the hour out of your time. Again, these updates are usually they're meant to be 25 to maybe 45 minutes. This one went way over. Okay. Have a pleasant and enjoyable day.